Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 7 over the skeleton. We'll look first at the two main divisions, axial and appendicular. This will call back information from Chapter 6 and will be important information to know about in order to better understand Chapter 8. So first and foremost, the human skeleton consists of 206 named bones. And of those 206 named bones, some make up the axial skeleton and others make up the appendicular skeleton. Now the axial skeleton includes the skull, thorax, and vertebral column. So that includes individual vertebrae, the sternum, ribs, the skull, even the small auditory ossicles or ear bones that are within the skull. It also includes the hyoid bone. The appendicular skeleton includes all of the bones of your upper and lower limbs, so your extremities, but it also includes the girdles, both the pelvic girdle and the pectoral girdle. And we're going to look at those girdles and look at the bones that make them up. But keep in mind that the bones of these girdles are a part of the appendicular skeleton. So here is a really good overview of those two main divisions. So again, 206 named bones for the human skeleton. Two divisions, axial we see here on the left and appendicular on the right. Now, on the right, we could list for the upper limbs the humerus, ulna, radius, carpals, which are your wrist bones, metacarpals found in your hand, so near your palm, and your phalanges. Now, phalanges, of course, count for both your fingers and your toes. For the lower limbs, we would count the femur, patella, fibula, tibia, tarsals, which are your ankle bones, metatarsals are in your foot, and the phalanges, of course, are your toes. But we also have to count those girdles, and I said I was going to talk about them. The pectoral girdle could also be called the shoulder girdle. It includes your clavicle, which you might know as your collarbone, and your scapula, which is that chicken wing bone on the back. So clavicle and scapula, those are the two bones of the pectoral girdle, and they are a part of the appendicular skeleton. Now the pelvic or hip girdle is a little easier. It's just your two hip bones. Your hip bones are also known as pelvic bones, or they're known as coxal bones. So those are the bones of your appendicular skeleton. For the axial skeleton, think of the axis of the body, kind of down that mid-sagittal section. One bone you might forget about is the hyoid, which is found in the cervical region. It's actually not attached to any other bone, so it doesn't articulate with another bone. It's just attached by ligaments. For your skull, we have to include the cranial and facial bones. We must include the auditory ossicles of the skull as well. Also, we have to think about the vertebral column. So we have the cervical, thoracic, and lumbar vertebrae, plus the sacrum, plus the coccyx, which is your tailbone. And then for the thorax itself, we're looking at the sternum, which you may know as your breastbone, and the ribs. And we're going to look at some of these bones in just a little bit more detail. So first, let's start with the skull. Let's start with the axial skeleton. So the skull may also be called the cranium, but there are cranial bones and facial bones, so generally it's called the skull, just to make sure there's no confusion. There's 22 bones in the skull. Let's look at the cranial bones first. So these are the 8 bones responsible for protecting things like the brain. They're the site of attachment for head and neck muscles. And these 8 cranial bones form the cranial cavity. There is one frontal bone, which is right here in dark green. 2 parietal bones, so we're just seeing the right side of the skull. There would be another one on the other side. 2 temporal bones, same thing, there'd be another temporal bone on the other side of the skull. 1 occipital bone, 1 sphenoid bone, and 1 ethmoid bone. So again, frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal. You can see part of the ethmoid bone in the orbital space. So if you look in the eye or bony orbit, you can see part of the sphenoid bone in front of the temporal bone. But mostly the temporal bone, parietal bone, occipital, frontal, those are going to be external. They're going to be easily viewed, whereas most of the sphenoid and the ethmoid bone are internal. So here's a better view of the sphenoid and ethmoid. So this is what the sphenoid bone looks like, kind of like a moth or a bat. Then over here is the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone makes up a fair amount of the nasal cavity, it's going to be in front of, at least mostly, the sphenoid bone. So we have the ethmoid bone, just that superior part, so this crista gyi, this ridge, that is right here. So if you want to compare this bone to its embedded form in the cranium, just compare crista gyi to where it is here over to this one right here. Those are both the same structure. So if you were looking inside, so if you've taken off the skull cap on your model, say you're in lab and you have a skull in front of you and you take off the skull cap, you're really only going to be able to see part of the ethmoid bone, and you'll be able to see the crista gyi, which is a ridge, and then the two kind of flat spaces beside it. The flat spaces beside it with little holes, that's the cribriform plate. But in general, what we'd find from the ethmoid bone is that it contains thin projections. It includes the nasal concha. Those would usually be lined with mucous membranes. Overall, the convolutions of the ethmoid bone work to increase surface area, specifically in the nasal cavity. It helps humidify inhaled trapped air. It helps catch some inhaled particles that don't need to make it into your lungs. But really, with all these main functions of the ethmoid bone, its most vital function would be protection of the vital organs in that nasal cavity. So it's really going to help support the nose. But remember, we also found part of it in the eye orbit, so it also helps support part of that eye orbit. So it's both structural and functional. It's mostly functional for the respiratory system, so you'll hear more about these structures like the nasal concha, the mucous membranes, humidification of inhaled air, things like that when you get to Anatomy and Physiology 2 and talk about that structural component of the respiratory system. But for right now, we just wanted the bone, we want to know it's internal, we want to know it's in cranial bone. We should be familiar with things like crista gyi and cribriform plate. We should know it's an irregular bone. It's not a short bone or a long bone or a flat bone. The ethmoid bone was one of our irregular bones. So let's flip over to our kind of moth or bat-shaped sphenoid bone. You have this upper region right here. I'll also outline it over here on the pink bone, which is still the sphenoid. That is the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone. Whereas the parts, if we go back over here to the left, that look like the actual wings of our moth or of our bat, that's the greater wing of the sphenoid bone. So the four foramen of the sphenoid bone that you should be familiar with from your lab class, which are foramen rotundum, ovale, spinosum, and lateral foramen of the sphenoid bone are located on the greater wing of the sphenoid bone. There's other structures like the sella turcica, and that's also called the hypophyseal fossa. That's where the pituitary gland sits. So there's different structures to learn about the sphenoid bone. But it's internal. It's supportive. It supports things like this pituitary gland. It's going to have conduits for different nerves, hence the foramen. So it's also going to be a cranial bone. It's also going to be protective. There's some similarities you may or may not be picking up on when we compare the sphenoid bone to the ethmoid bone. But let's move on to the facial bones. So I'll read through them first and then let's identify them on the right. So you have two nasal bones, two maxillary bones, sometimes called maxillae, two zygomatic bones, think of those as your cheekbones. You have a mandible, which is the only movable skull bone, two lacrimal bones, which are in the eye orbit, two palatine bones, think of that as like the hard palate at the roof of your mouth. Then you have two inferior nasal concha. These nasal concha are going to be inside the nasal cavity, or the bony part of the nasal cavity, and then you also have the vomer, which is part of your nasal septum. Overall, the facial bones are going to supply the framework of the face. They supply structures for sense organs to attach to. They are going to give the teeth something to attach to. There's plenty of openings for air, for food, some for nerves, and they're able to be anchors for the facial muscles for expression. So let's look at our facial bones. So let's start with, we have two nasal bones. So you have one here, they're fused in the middle. Next you have two maxillae, or maxillary bones. So above your teeth and going up near the nasal bone, so in yellow, we have one maxillary bone fused right here in the middle. Then over here on the right, or you are right if you're looking at this PowerPoint, another maxillary bone. So 2 nasal bones, 2 maxillary bones, 2 zygomatic bones in pink. So again, think of those as your cheekbones. You can also see these are making up part of the eye orbit. You also have the mandible here in orange, just one, not fused, below the teeth, only movable skull bone. The lacrimal bones are going to be inside the eye orbit. So you can actually see the color right here, but they're right inside the eye orbit, so just inside, away from that maxillary. You have 2, so you have one in this eye orbit, and you have one over here in this eye orbit. 2 palatine bones, let's move up. So here you have one on the left, one on the right, fused in the middle. What's in front of them are the palatine processes. We can see these convoluted shapes in the nasal cavity. Those are the nasal concha. And then right in the middle, that is the vomer. So again, that's part of your nasal septum. Also in this image is just plenty of other structures that you need to know, especially if you're taking a lab for this class. Some structures include the optic canal. You also have things like the perpendicular plate, and then the middle nasal concha, which are also part of the ethmoid bone. The vomer plus the perpendicular plate make up the entirety of your nasal septum. So you have plenty of other structures to learn. I'm not going to go through all of them. Your lab is mainly going to be what's focusing on these individual names and where they're located. But it is important to realize that your lecture textbook is a great resource for learning the names and locations of not only bones, but their bony structures. So here's just another image. Since we're going to talk about sutures, I'll point some of them out. Sutures are going to be fibrous joints between skull bones, and they tend to be kind of little wavy lines. So here's one parietal bone, here's another, we know that's behind the frontal bone, and the 2 parietal bones are held together via a sagittal suture, called the sagittal suture because it goes along the sagittal section. You also have the lambdoid suture, which is going to be between the parietal bones in pink and the occipital bone in brown. So sutures, again, those are going to come back, we're going to talk about them, but here's a really good image. Here's another image of the side view. We can see again how even though the sphenoid and ethmoid are more internal, we can see parts of them on the outside of the skull. We have a better view of the mandible and how it fits kind of as a modified hinge up on the temporal bone. We can see that the zygomatic bone fuses with the temporal bone, and in that location where they fuse, they form the zygomatic arch, and then right behind the arch is the zygomatic process. So it is interesting that the zygomatic process is on the temporal bone. Most of the time the name of the bone or the name of the bony structure tells you where it's located. In this case, we'd have to know what's located near it as well. Here's an inferior view of the skull, so we can see a better view of the palatine bones that are fused in the middle, palatine processes, even the incisive foramen. Let's see other things we can see. We can see the foramen magnum, so that's at the base of the skull. Foramen means whole, and magnum means large or huge. So this is basically the large hole at the base of the skull. Plenty of other foramens, those are usually conduits for nerves or blood vessels. We have things like the mandibular fossa, which in it fits the mandibular condyle. So fossas are depressions, foramens are holes. So tons of different structures to see. Start and try to pick up on the similarities among words, like foramen, like fossa, like condyle. Other things we can see are the inferior nuchal line and the superior nuchal line. So the superior nuchal line is going to be in line with the external occipital protuberance. The external occipital protuberance is the bump on the back of the skull. It's on the occipital bone. And there's 2 ridges next to the external occipital protuberance, and that makes up the superior nuchal line. Then there's going to be 2 ridges below it, and that's the inferior nuchal line. Again, we're looking at an inferior view, but the inferior nuchal line would be below the superior if we were holding the skull upwards. Here's another internal view for the base of the skull, so we can see the foramen magnum. what we can really see is another view of the sphenoid bone, this time in green. Here is the part of the ethmoid bone we can see in orange. Remember, we can always see in this view the cristogyri and the cribriform plates. The holes in the cribriform plate are olfactory foramina. Foramina means tiny hole, and those are actually going to be for nerves for the sense of smell. Next, let's look at the bony orbit. So the orbits that your eye fits in are made up of bone. Normally there's muscles and fat around the eye, but here that's been removed, so we can just see the bones that make up these bony cavities. The eyes would firmly be encased and cushioned by the missing fatty tissue, like I said, and you've been able to see as we looked at the facial bones that a lot of these bones are helping to make up this orbit. So we actually have our eye orbit only because 7 bones come together to form this socket. Those bones are the frontal, sphenoid, zygomatic, maxilla, palatine, lacrimal, and ethmoid bone. And all of those are facial bones except for the frontal bone and the ethmoid bone, as well as the sphenoid bone. So the orbits are actually made up of cranial and facial bones. The nasal cavity is made up of the vomer, ethmoid, palatine, and maxillary bones. And it's going to be more forward than the sphenoid bone. So you can see that even though the sphenoid bone is right behind it, it's not being included as a part of the nasal cavity. Next, we're going to look at unique features of the skull. So we're still in the skull. That includes the sutures that we've already pointed out, then paranasal sinuses and fontanelles. So sutures, again, are just immovable joints. They're joints that hold skull bones together. Paranasal sinuses are cavities within some of the cranial and facial bones, so we'll look at those. And then fontanelles are found in infants. So they're areas of unossified tissue because at birth you need these unossified tissue spaces, which commonly are called soft spots, to allow compression of the skull, flexibility of the skull, so that the skull fits through the birth canal. And they remain for some time after birth until they completely ossify or turn into hard bone tissue. So let's look at the sutures first. So we already looked at the coronal and lambdoid in kind of better views. But here we have a side view of the skull. So the coronal suture is along the frontal plane, which is also called the coronal plane, and it's going to separate the frontal bone from the 2 parietal bones. Then on the side of the skull, you have a suture that separates the temporal bone from parts of the parietal bone and parts of the occipital bone. That is called the squamous suture. Then on the back of the skull, separating the occipital bone from the 2 parietal bones, is the lambdoid suture. And then last but not least, which we've already seen, is the sagittal suture, but this is a better view. We see its entirety. It separates the 2 parietal bones. Also here we can see, even though it's not highlighted, the elongated form of the coronal suture. The paranasal sinuses are found in the frontal, sphenoid, ethmoid, and maxillary bones. They are lined with mucosa, so that's going to be epithelial and connective tissue. It's a wet epithelial and connective tissue. They're filled with air, and in general, their function is to allow air to enter from the nasal cavity and then drain mucus into the nasal cavity from these sinuses. So it's kind of meant to help humidify inhaled air. It's also supposed to make sure that voices resonate a certain way in our skull and then outwards as we talk. But these paranasal sinuses can become clogged. So if you ever had a sinus headache, it's because the mucus drainage from these paranasal sinuses has gotten blocked and a vacuum has built up in these spaces. And that vacuum creates pressure, kind of a reverse negative pressure, and that generates the headache or the pain. Here we have the fontanelles, and there's several. There's the posterior fontanelle between the early parietal and occipital bones. There's a fontanelle between the parietal bones and the temporal bone. So that'll eventually be the squamous suture. And there's an anterior fontanelle, so that's going to be between the early frontal bone and then the parietal bones. The last fontanelle to ossify is the anterior fontanelle, so it'd be the last one to completely turn to bone. So the general function of the skull and skull bones, mainly protective. They're going to eventually fuse, and that most skull bones, therefore, are not going to be very movable. So the sutures are really helpful in holding skull bones together. There are attachment sites for muscles, there's conduits, there's foramen, there's things for nerves and blood vessels to get through. But because muscles attach to these bones, the ones that are around the face allow for facial expressions. And overall, we just saw that not only are they protective, but they're forming kind of the basic framework of the skull, basic framework of the face. And so they have many different support, protective, framework, cushioning, attachment, those types of functions. Some of their functions include creating entrances to the digestive and the respiratory systems, mainly through the nasal and oral canal. Next, let's look at the hyoid bone. So the hyoid bone does not articulate with any other bone. The term articulate means touch or form a joint with. For example, the tibia does articulate with the femur, so that's at the knee joint. But the hyoid bone does not articulate with another bone. Instead, it's going to be held in place by some muscles, mainly ligaments, and it's there really to keep the larynx patent or to keep it open. It also is a good attachment site for some of the tongue muscles and for muscles of the neck and the pharynx. It's a weird little shape. It has these two little horns. It is a kind of irregular C shape. It's an irregular shaped bone, and you would find it kind of right above the voice box, but below the tongue, so in that cervical region. Next, let's look at the vertebral column. You may have also called the vertebral column the spine or the backbone or the spinal column. All of those are fine. General functions: protects the spinal cord, which is within their vertebral canals, supports the head, specifically the cervical spine, and serves as an attachment point for the ribs, pelvic girdle, and muscles. Now, depending on which type of vertebrae you're talking about, whether it's cervical, thoracic, or lumbar, it might have one or more of these functions or serve all of them. In general, the vertebral column is curved to varying degrees. This curvature actually gives the vertebral column strength. It helps maintain balance in an upright position, and it absorbs shock during walking, and that helps protect the vertebrae from fracture. What also helps protect the vertebrae from fracture is fibrocartilaginous material between the vertebrae. Here's the general shape of the vertebrae. We can see that there is a cervical curvature, a thoracic curvature, and a lumbar curvature, and that the sacrum is convex. So we have 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic vertebrae, 5 lumbar vertebrae, and the sacrum is made up of 5 fused vertebrae, whereas the coccyx is made up of 4 fused vertebrae. These are all the parts of the vertebral column. We have the different curvatures. Also notice that as we go from cervical to lumbar, that the vertebrae get larger. Also notice that the sacrum is in a location to attach to the pelvic bones or your coxal bones. And then you may know your coccyx as the tailbone. A way to remember how many cervical, how many thoracic, and how many lumbar vertebrae you have is think about the times when you should eat food. I'm not saying when you eat food, but the general kind of stereotypical times when you should eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So you would eat breakfast at 7, so 7 cervical vertebrae. You would eat lunch at 12, so 12 thoracic vertebrae. And you would eat dinner at 5, so that's for the 5 lumbar vertebrae. Now, some special things about each region. We have 7 cervical vertebrae, but the first 2 get special names. The first cervical vertebrae, or C1, is called the atlas. The second cervical vertebrae, or C2, is called the axis. And they fit together in a certain way that allows the head to move up and down, left and right. For example, there's a specialized structure on the axis called the odontoid process. And then there's a ligament that wraps around this odontoid process and attaches to the atlas. When you're looking at the thoracic region, think of the torso. These are going to be the vertebrae that articulate with the ribs, so attach to the ribs. They're going to attach to the ribs on their posterior side, whereas the ribs are going to attach to the sternum on their anterior side. With the lumbar vertebrae, we're going to see these are really large, and because they're so large, they have plenty of room for the attachment of large back muscles. The sacrum is above the coccyx, but they're both inferior to the other vertebrae. Again, the sacrum is going to attach to the pelvic girdle, but it's not counted as part of the pelvic girdle, but the pelvic bones and the sacrum are a part of the axial skeleton. The coccyx, again, you also call the tailbone, and it's formed by the fusion of coccygeal vertebrae, just like the sacrum is formed by the fusion of sacral vertebrae. There are disorders associated with the vertebral column. There's kyphosis, lordosis, scoliosis, and these are all abnormal curvatures of the vertebral column. So scoliosis is an S-shaped abnormal curvature. Kyphosis is going to be a curvature that usually affects either the cervical or thoracic vertebrae the most, produces kind of a humpback appearance, whereas lordosis is going to be an abnormal curvature of the lumbar vertebrae and kind of produces kind of an inward lumbar curve, or something that is sometimes called swayback. So let's next look at the normal structure for cervical vertebrae, then thoracic, then lumbar vertebrae. So we'll start with these 7 cervical vertebrae. They're the smallest, they're the lightest, and they are the only vertebrae that have transverse foramen. So remember that name, transverse foramen. Thoracic and lumbar vertebrae do not contain transverse foramen. So let's come over here, let's look at the basic view of a cervical vertebrae. It has its spinous process, which is the pointy part. It has a body, relatively oval, but small. And it's going to have 2 holes on one on each side of the body. These are the transverse foramen. You don't see these in any of the other vertebrae. So, a relatively notable oval body, kind of a triangular space in front of it called the vertebral foramen. Pretty short spinous process compared to some of the others like the thoracic, and the most notable would be the transverse foramen, so which are one on each side of the body. The cervical vertebrae look a little different if we're looking at C1 or C2, the atlas and the axis, because the atlas has no body and no spinous process. And then when we look at the axis, it's going to have a dens. It's going to have this odontoid process, this projection on its anterior surface. Or superior surface, sorry. So here in the anterior view is the dens or odontoid process of the axis, also the second cervical vertebrae. And the atlas would sit kind of right over top that. This would be internal to the back of the atlas. So you can see how they sit together. So here is our atlas sitting on top of the axis. The axis would sit internal to the back of the C1 vertebrae. And then wrapping around the dens or the odontoid process is going to be the transverse ligament. And again, this allows the neck to move kind of left and right, up and down. Think of it as allowing you to say yes and no. Next, let's look at the thoracic vertebrae. So we have 12 thoracic vertebrae. They have a heart-shaped body. We have a heart-shaped body. They're going to have a round vertebral foramen, a little bit longer on the spinous process, pretty long. And if you look at them from the side, they kind of look like a giraffe. Whereas the lumbar vertebrae has a triangular vertebral foramen. It's really large, and it has a large oval body. And then from the side, it looks like a moose. Here we can compare all 3. So if we're looking at cervical to lumbar, cervical and lumbar have triangular vertebral foramen. Thoracic has a round vertebral foramen. Cervical has a short spinous process compared to the longer ones we see in thoracic and lumbar. Thoracic has a heart-shaped body. Lumbar has an oval-shaped body, just like cervical, but cervical vertebrae have transverse foramen near the body, which neither thoracic or lumbar have. So just make sure that you pay attention not only to the different sizes, starting from small at cervical, moving upward in size on our way to lumbar, but the shapes of the vertebral foramen, specialized structures like the transverse foramen, and the shapes of the bodies. Those are the most likely to give you information about which type of vertebrae you were looking at. And then we'll quickly just kind of finish out our talk about the vertebral column, or your spine, by looking at the sacrum and the coccyx. So you have the anterior and posterior view here. So posterior view on the right, you can see that the sacrum is superior to the coccyx. They're both consisting of multiple fused vertebrae. And the coccyx is going to be inferior to the sacrum. They're going to make up kind of the stabilization of the spinal column as it attaches at the sacroiliac joint right here to the pelvic bones. In between the vertebral column, so in between each individual vertebrae, you're going to see intervertebral discs. And a large amount of intervertebral disc is made up of fibrocartilage. It's actually the annulus fibrosus that surrounds the nucleus pulposus, the middle part of the intervertebral disc, that's made up of both collagen and fibrocartilage. So that really helps absorb vertical shock, permit some various movements of the vertebral column, and really helps to form strong joints. The nucleus pulposus does all these same things, but it's an intergelatinous nucleus, and it's going to give more of that elasticity and compressibility, whereas the vertical shock absorption abilities come from the fibrocartilage itself. You can also see within the vertebral foramen is where the spinal cord would be. Alright, next we're going to move on to the bony thorax, so make sure to watch the next part of this video.